Hey, yo, what's up? This Disciple Marcello Kearns reign back up in this anti-Illuminati all day, anti-America all day. So this video is going to be about um, the 8 generations of America. The 8 generations of America. And I'm going to be going from the year 1883 to the present time. So it makes up 8 generations. These are, for the most part, the generations that make up most of the history that you know. Most of it. Like I said, it starts from 1883 and it's all the way up to the present time. I will be mentioning the last generation, which is up until 2025, which is 2 years from now. So I'm going to be starting with the first generation, started from 1883. This was called the lost generation, right? This is called the lost generation. The lost generation starts from 1883 to the year 1900. Now, listen closely and think about all the history that took place during these dates that I'm giving you of these of the years of these generations. Follow it with your mind like a timeline. Most people have in their minds a timeline of the history of America, right? So as you're following the dates that I give you of these generations, follow the timeline of the history here in this country. So the lost generation, that's the name of it. I didn't give it the name. This is the name that it's called. Now, you either know this information or you don't. Before I studied and educated myself on it, I didn't know this information. So you either know this information or you don't. Just be a student right now and listen to, the different generations that make up most of the generations that, as far as history, that you've come to know concerning this country. All the significant history, most of it will be these 8 generations that I'm mentioning. So the oldest one will be that I'm dating, going back to, would be the lost generation. Now, the lost generation starts from 1883 to the year 1900. From the year it starts at the year 1883 to the year 1900. That's all the children born in 1883 to the year 1900, right? That's the lost generation. The lost generation. The next is the greatest generation. The greatest generation starts from 1901, the year 1901 to the year 1927. Okay, so everybody born between the year 1901 and the year 1927 here in America represents the greatest generation, right? The next one is the baby boomers, which represents 1946 to 1964. Now, with the baby boomers, there's 2 generations. When I did my studies, I found that there were 2 generations. The first generation is starting from 1946 to 1954. So that's 8 years. The second generation of baby boomers is from 1955 to 1964, which is 9 years. So the first generation of baby boomers is 8 years. The second generation of baby boomers is 9 years. Okay? That's 2 generations of baby boomers. One is people born in matter of 8 years, from 1946 to 1954, and then the next 9 years would be the second generation of baby boomers. So the first generation of baby boomers is from 1946 to 1954, which is 8 years. And the second generation of baby boomers will be the next 9 years. Okay? The next generation, these are all American generations. The next generation is Generation X. Now, Generation X starts from, which is my generation, it starts from 1965 and it is complete at 1984. So that's Generation X from 1965 to 1984, right? Then the next generation, which I'm also a part of, which I think is pretty cool that I'm a part of 2 generations. I'm a part of Generation X and I'm a part of the millennials. Now, the millennials starts from 1981 to 1995. That's the millennials. So, I'm me being born in 1981. As I was born, I am a part of 2 generations. Generation X is 1965 to 1984. The millennials starts at the year I was born, which is 1981 to 1995. So again, millennials, that generation is from 1981 to 1995. Everybody born between 1981 and 1995, right? That's people in their late 20s, I would think. And yeah, their late 20s into their 30s and 40s. Generation Z is next after the millennials. You have Generation Z. Generation Z represents everybody born from 1996 to 2010. So that's people in their 20s. That's people in their in their 20s. Yep. So that's Generation Z. Generation Alpha is the present generation. All the kids being born right now. That's Generation Alpha. Generation Alpha goes from 2011 to 2025. So all the children born between 2011 and 2025 represents Generation Alpha, which is the present generation. It will be complete in 2005, and then a new generation will start. So there you have it. You have the lost generation, the greatest generation. You have the silent generation. You have the baby boomers generation. You have Generation X. You have the millennials generation. You have Generation Z. You have Generation Alpha. Okay? Those are 8 generations. Those are the generations that make up most of your history, safe to say, from the year 1883 to the present time. That's going all the way up to 2005. That last generation will be complete in 2005. 2025. So I'm covering generations from just now. I just covered generations from 1883 to up into the generation that will be complete in 2025. So I'm going to be breaking down who was significant in these generations, who are the people that were detrimental to out of these generations, people that were villains in these generations. I'm going to show you who was most helpful. I'm going to show you who was failed in these generations. I'm going to show you why we have what we have going on in our community. Why there is no more Malcolm X's, there's no more great people. There's a reason. And it has to do with the generations. And a lot of people haven't taken this approach to put two and two together and figure out the situations. So that's basically, what God has showed me, is that these generations are the reason why America failed. Specific generations are the reason why America failed. And particularly it was the baby boomers generation. And I'm going to be getting into that. But before I do, I want to go into who were the people that were significant to us, as to this community, to the American community. I'm going to go into who was significant, who helped, who contributed, and I'm just going to be using the Titans, which is Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. They came from the silent generation. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. came from the silent generation. And I think it's ironic that they came from the silent generation because they were the most vocal of leaders in this community. So, but they came from the silent generation. So MLK and Malcolm X comes from the silent generation, right? So it's safe to say the silent generation was the generation that contributed the most impact to equality, change, revolution here in America, as far as equality for all people of all different tribes. It would be the silent generation that had the most impact, basically, being that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. came from the silent generation. So the silent generation probably was the most impactful generation as far as true change and true revolution. Okay. I will note that also Louis Farrakhan came from the silent generation as well. It's just that generation contributed the most to this community. Now, the baby boomers, I pulled a couple names. I could have pulled a million names from all these generations, but I just pulled certain names, that were relevant and names that would help you to see who contributed and who were problems generation-wise. So you see, the silent generation was the most impactful generation by far, as far as true change and revolution and equality for everybody, not just, people who white America, and people who pioneered for in earlier times, because they didn't pioneer, before the silent generation. They wasn't really pioneering per se for, black people or any other race except for white people. So they were, the greatest generation and the lost generation in America. They wasn't really pioneering per se for equality. They wasn't pioneering for a revolution to where everyone is treated equal. It was up to the silent generation. It came about by the silent generation. That's who it came about by, which that generation started from 1928 to 1945. So, okay, you got the baby boomers, which were, like I said, Bill Clinton. He was a baby boomer. Donald Trump is a baby boomer. You see where I'm going with this? Barack Obama was a good baby boomer. Al Sharpton is a baby boomer as well. He's a good baby boomer. And then you had the greatest generation, which represents Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. Some would say, especially with Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. Some people say, with him too, with all how he handled things in the 80s. You know, yeah, they come from the greatest generation. Edgar Hoover, which was gang stalking Martin Luther King Jr. Basically, he was gang stalking Martin Luther King Jr. Edgar Hoover came from the lost generation, right? And he's the one that sent the tapes to Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife, and of Martin Luther King Jr. cheating on his wife. Edgar Hoover is responsible for that. He comes from the lost generation, which is the first generation that I mentioned, which means he was born from 1880 to 1900. He was born in one of those years. Very old man. And he was an adversary of Martin Luther King Jr. without a cause. You know, he gang stalked him. So that's one of your villains. I'm showing you, you know, people who contributed and the villain. One of the main villains being that he was he went after Martin Luther King Jr. The main villains, one of the main villains in your community, our American community, would have to be Edgar Hoover, because he just had it out for Martin Luther King Jr. He came from the lost generation. So as you can see, like I said, you know, the generations before the silent generation, they wasn't pioneering or doing anything or contributing for everyone. They were contributing for white Americans. You know, Edgar Hoover came from the lost generation. He wasn't trying to help MLK. He wasn't trying to help Martin Luther King Jr. He was gang stalking him. You know, so you know, I'm showing you the villains too. And I might add also Richard Nixon coming from the greatest generation. The FBI illegally protected Richard Nixon from investigation. That's a fact. The FBI illegally protected Richard Nixon from investigation when he was going through the Watergate and all, you know, all that stuff. So there you have it. You have, you know, the main generations that make up America. So it's the lost generation from 1883 to the year 1900. You have the greatest generation from 1901 to 1927. You have the silent generation from 1928 to 1945. You have the baby boomers generation from 1946 to 1964. You have Generation X from 1965 to 1984. You have the millennials generation from 1981 to 1995. You have Generation Z from 1996 to 2010. And you have Generation Alpha from 2011 to the present time, being complete in 2025. Now, what I'm going to show you is where America got off track and where America went wrong. I'm going to show you where America failed, you know, because we have to admit there, you know, someone failed. When you look at Malcolm X and you look at Martin Luther King Jr., you look at that movement, and then it just became a drug-infested country, a sexually charged country, all kind of crazy stuff going on, you know, gang banging and everything in between. Safe to say, you know, the country failed. So the Lord gave me revelation of what caused the failure. the failure was caused by generations. Listen to what I just said. The failure started from Pacific generations. It didn't just start, out of nowhere, and then you can't figure out how it happened. You can't figure out where it began and all of that. The way God showed me is that it came from the failure started with specific generations. This is good, man. This is good. Because I'm going to show you in a factual way how this happened. I'm going to show you without a doubt how by generation there was failure. There was extreme failure, which would indicate where the failure started. I'm going to show you where the failure started. Okay? So if I had to pick any generation that failed us the most, it would have to be the baby boomers generation. That's the two generations. One of, like I told you, the baby boomers generation there's two generations. One is 8 years and one is 9 years. So in these baby boomer generations, they make up the people born between 1946 and 1964. Right? This generation is absolutely the most instrumental in failing the American community. It's people. People have to fail in a country in order for us all to fail, right? So people have to fail here, and those people represent why we are not successful. So the main generation, you couldn't say it was the silent generation. That's the MLK and Malcolm X generation. They had the greatest impact. And you couldn't say it was the generations before the silent generation, which was the greatest generation, the lost generation, because they were not concerned. They failed in a way where they was not concerned with equality for all. That's how they failed. But for the most part, they wasn't even focused on equality. Black people were in their zone and they had strength, and they had their integrity. They had their character, and they hadn't yet lost that. Even though the lost generation and the greatest generation was not helping them. These are real names for these generations, and I would advise you to look up information on these specific generations. These are I won't say look up all of them, but I would say between lost generation, greatest generation, silent generation, baby boomers, up to Generation X. 5 generations. Those are the 5 generations you should study, so you can see the progression and the decline of progression in this country. The lost generation, like I said, in the greatest generation, the 2 oldest generations, starting from 1883, ending at 1927, those two generations were not focused on equality for all. However, the African Americans had not yet they hadn't failed themselves or given up yet. They hadn't fallen to drugs and that's what I mean. They hadn't fallen to the American experience yet. They still were were strong. They were relentless. They were persistent in living a better life. I would say they were just maintaining, if you will. They were surviving, if you will, at those in the times between the lost generation, the greatest generation. But white America, they were still, racist. The people born in the lost generation, the greatest generation, they were still racist. They were still, persecuting black people. They were still, all about pioneering for white people. I'm pretty sure they didn't have much respect for Native Americans. So that's how they were villains. That's how they failed. They were stuck. They were stuck in their ways. They were stuck in their beliefs. They were stuck in their perceptions. That's how they failed. It wasn't up until the silent generation, which is the greatest generation, I would say, because Malcolm X and MLK was in it, right? That's why I would say that was the greatest generation, just because of those two titans. They brought about the most change. They brought about the revolution. So the silent generation brought about the most change and brought about a revolution. So that's a generation to study. You have to listen very closely, because every generation isn't responsible for why the country is the way it is. For example, silent generation, which is Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., they're not responsible for none of this stuff going on. You can't hold their generation responsible. You can't say they're responsible for what you have before you. They brought about the revolution. They brought about the freedoms. That's how they contributed from their generation, being the silent generation. The baby boomers was the worst failing generation, in my opinion. That's the generation from 1946 to 1964. Now, here's the thing. The baby boomers were the children of Malcolm X and MLK. They were the children. They were the recipients of all of that energy that came from the Malcolm X movement and the MLK movement. They were the children. Their parents were the crowd that watched MLK and Malcolm X. They were also the silent generation. So the crowd of the people that was listening to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., they were the silent generation. They were around the same ages as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. They were around the same ages, right? So they are it's safe to say they were the ones that their children were the ones that would receive all of that information and that energy. Those children, the next generation, would be the baby boomers. The baby boomers were the ones that heard all the stories about what their parents were doing at the Crusades, and they were getting all the teachings and the perspective of Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachings and Malcolm X teachings. They were getting the children that were getting those perspectives was the next generation, which was the baby boomers. So they were the recipients. It's safe to say the baby boomers were the recipients of all of that energy. They were the recipients of all of that. Now you see what I'm saying? So they were the most promising, because now you have a generation that will not have to go through the same inequality, and they can receive this information, and they can receive, you know, this perspective, and they can run with it and make a better America. They were the true hope because their parents were the ones, like I said, in the crowds among Martin Luther King Jr., who marched with him, who marched with Malcolm X, who, you know, who were in the organizations with Malcolm X and with Martin Luther King Jr. Their parents, the baby boomers' parents, were the people surrounding them. They were the people that were surrounding Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., the baby boomers' parents. So when the baby boomers' parents came home, as you can imagine, they shared all this information. They imparted all of this perspective. They were excited. Just imagine. They had seen no one like Malcolm X. They had seen no one like MLK. Safe to say their children were well aware of who Malcolm X was. The baby boomers were well aware of Martin Luther King Jr. because they were the kids. They were the next generation. And as you can imagine, like any good parent, you will want your children now, with this revolution going on, to aspire to be great. Now you see where we at in history. To aspire to be great, to aspire to be revolutionary minded. Their parents were on fire. The baby boomers' parents were on fire with these new revolutionaries that brought about change. So it's safe to say that, being that the African American community had never experienced a MLK or a Malcolm X, right? They were excited, and they shared that excitement with their children. Those children were the baby boomers. They shared that experience, that perspective. They groomed their children in those perspectives and mindsets of Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement, of Malcolm X movement. Those children that were groomed in that were the baby boomers. That was the baby boomers generation. And if you don't know why they're called the baby boomers, is because after the war, after the World War, I think it was World War II, they were having so many, the military was coming back and you know, they were impregnating their wives. Their wives were conceiving, you know, so obviously being away from their wives, they came back and they had kids. So that generation, those kids were called the baby boomers because it was such a boom in conception. It was such a boom in women conceiving, being that their husbands had just come back from war. So that's why they're called the baby boomers. So you see that the silent generation, the baby boomers, were, like I said, the ones that received all of the grooming from the Malcolm X movement, from the MLK movement. They were perfect, painting portraits, if you will, to paint a new day of revolution in a new revolutionary mindset, because they were young, and the baby boomers were young, you know, around right after that revolution, right after those revolutions, and they could receive. They were perfect to groom in these revolutions, with the environment now having changed to a degree. Now it's a little different after Malcolm X and MLK. It's way different, especially after they were lost. Now it was way more respect for African Americans. And so now they can take the information, they can take the perspective and the mindsets, being unbothered in the environment, and run with it. Now you see why, what I'm showing you. Now you would say, well, then how they fail us? You would say, well, how they fail us? I'm going to get to that. Now, the next generation you got is Generation X, which represents my generation. We are the children of the baby boomers. We are the children of the people that were groomed in the Malcolm X experience and the MLK experience. They are our parents. My generation, they're our parents. They were the children that were groomed in the mindset and the perspective of those revolutions and this new perspective concerning African American revolution. They were groomed in it. Our parents were groomed in it. Generation X parents were groomed in this perspective. Our parents, being baby boomers, being groomed from the silent generation, they had the mindset and the information. They had the revolution, so to speak. They had it. They had it in their hearts. They had it in their minds. Their parents installed it. Their parents downloaded it, if you will. They downloaded the mindsets of MLK and Malcolm X. So now those are our parents, the people that got the downloads, the people that were groomed with this in this new environment where there's respect for more African Americans, that, you know, and their parents are revealing to them the experience of the revolution, the change, right? Now those are our parents that were groomed and drenched with the information. They wasn't there hands-on per se. Our parents, the baby boomers, parents of Generation X, they wasn't there per se, but they received from their parents that were there all the vibration, the energy, the experiences, the history of the situation. So them being kids, they were perfect. They should, the revolution being put in them could have been done to perfection, because kids seen, you know, how their parents was responding to this, and they could have easily aspire in direction. They could easily aspire in this direction, seeing the excitement of their parents and just being obedient to their parents, being students of their parents, being students of the silent generation. The baby boomers could have been students of the revolution of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Now, the students of the revolution of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. was our parents. My parents, your parents, if you're Generation X. Like I said, Generation X was born between 1965 and 1984. We were supposed to receive all of those teachings and vibrations that they got, that the baby boomers got from the silent generation. We were supposed to receive all of that energy. We were supposed to receive it on a whole nother level, where it was even articulated on a higher level, where it was even refined on a better level. Safe to say, with every passing generation, it should have been more refined. The revolution should have been more refined, right? So by the time you had the Generation X come along, they should have been, their parents should have been just refined in the revolution and had critiqued it and learned from mistakes of the leaders and used and took wisdom on what to do and not to do, and they could refine it and then pass that refined teaching on to Generation X, the refined teaching of revolution and change. They could pass that on to Generation X, my generation. So we were supposed, people born in my generation, Generation X, born between 1965 and 1984, you were supposed to be the students of refined revolution. You were supposed to be the students of refined change, and you were supposed to be a whole nother catalyst of change. Being that we were born in 1965 and 1984, now technology is coming. Now African Americans, now we're involved with the American culture. We're impacting it. We're accepted in the American culture. We, being students of refined revolution, we're supposed to take that into the culture, into the community, among the white people in a more innovative and sophisticated way. Considering all the technology, the progression of technology and the progression of culture. We wasn't able to do that because the baby boomers, being born from 1946 to 1964, by the time they were in their 20s, they were in 1984. And in 1984, baby boomers were also in their 30s and 40s, right? Safe to say in their 20s and 30s and early early 40s, right? Yeah. So 40s, 30s, 20s, that's what the baby boomers were in the 80s, in their 20s and 30s, in early 40s. Right? So as we know, in the 80s, in the white community and the black community, all communities had drug problems. In 1984, the baby boomers were in their 20s. So they were trying out and experimenting with crack. They were experimenting with freebasing. Freebasing came out in 1974, exactly. Freebasing is ammonia or ether and cocaine. And it's smoked. The chemical and everything of ammonia or ether is mixed with the cocaine, and it creates kind of like a cottage cheese. As I read, it said it looks like ricotta cheese, like crumbly cheese, right? That's how it comes. That's what it comes to when you mix freebasing cocaine. When you make freebase cocaine, it comes out to be, when you mix it with ammonia or ether, cocaine with ether or ammonia, it comes out to be like ricotta cheese, crumbly kind of cheese, like crumbly. They were smoking that, right? So there was freebasing in 1974. Baby boomers was in their 20s and 30s at that time too. And then crack came out. And then for the white side, they had, all the drugs that they had which was LSD and pills and cocaine and good cocaine and heroin. They had all, and PCP and everything else. The white side had the expensive drugs. By the 80s, when the baby boomers were in their 20s and 30s and early 40s, the white side had the expensive drugs, and the African Americans, they had freebasing and crack and cocaine and heroin. And probably, of course, some pills too. But what I'm trying to show you is this is where the boom came as far as drugs like nationwide, like seriously nationwide. And when drugs came on the scene, the main generation that was the recipient of all those different drugs was the baby boomers. They were the ones that was a recipient of all those drugs based on the time. I'm basing this on the obvious years. You know, you can't say babies were doing it. you can't say senior citizens was really doing it. So it's obviously the people that were in their 20s in those times, the 20s and 30s, which would be obviously the baby boomers being born between 1946 and 1964, which means they were in their 20s in 1984, their 20s and their 30s, and their in early 40s. So obviously 20s and 30s and early 40s was the main group doing the drugs, which was the baby boomers. They were the ones doing the main drugs in the 80s. In the 1980s, the baby boomers were the ones doing the most drugs. You have to understand this so you can see where we failed, where we started to fail as a community. And it wasn't just black people, it was white people too, because they were doing it, like I said, they were doing expensive drugs. They were doing the expensive stuff. Wherever they were living, wherever they were living, they were doing the expensive drugs. Yeah. They were doing expensive drugs. So everybody was up in smoke, safe to say. And this is why, this is one of the foundational reasons why Generation X was not a recipient of refined revolutionary mindset and teachings and vibration. Because the baby boomers was a recipient, their parents was a recipient of all the drug boom in America. It was the baby boomers, no pun intended. They were the recipient of all the drug boom. The crack epidemic was, the recipients of that when it first hit was the baby boomers. They were in their 20s in 1984. They was in their 30s, 20s and 30s and early 40s. They were the recipients. Generation X couldn't have been the recipients. We were born between, yeah, we could be too, because the early part of Generation X, because it starts at 1965, so by 1984 they were 19. Yeah, Generation X could be. Generation X, my generation was a little involved. So I'm glad I looked at that at the beginning of Generation X, because some people from Generation X were 19 and 20, early 20s and 19 when it first started. Which is worse, because that means probably when it first came out, parents and children were doing it. On their own, though. Children that were 19 from Generation X were trying it out. And the baby boomers that were in their 20s and 30s and early 40s, they were definitely doing it. So in some households, some parents, it's safe to say some children, 19, some 19-year-olds tried it. They did, because they didn't know what it was going to be. They didn't know yet how crack was going to affect the community. So it's safe to say some 19-year-olds were trying it out throughout all these metropolises of America, of course. So some children from Generation X were doing it and their parents were doing it, which makes even more sense why Generation X was not a recipient of revolutionary mindset, vibration, and teachings. So basically the revolution stopped with the baby boomers. They received the information. They received it, but they didn't pass it on. And this is why I say they failed us, because they did not pass the baton. They didn't pass the throne. They didn't pass the information. They didn't pass the grooming that they received from their parents. They didn't pass any of that and refine it to revolutionary teaching, revolutionary mindset, and revolutionary vibration. Okay? So when the drugs hit the scene, the baby boomers, the parents of Generation X were the recipients. And obviously, they neglected their children. Obviously, they didn't really care about a revolution after all the drugs came out. They didn't really care about a revolutionary mindset. And if they did, it was deteriorated by the drug scene. The revolutionary mindset was heavily deteriorated by the drug scene. Some people underestimate, or uncalculate is a better word, how powerful the impact of drugs in the white and black community, how impactful it was on the revolutionary mindset. I got to do a video. I got to do a video just on this. It impacted the revolution, the revolutionary mindset, almost, I would say, at 40%, 40 to 60%. That being said, this explains why you don't have a revolution today. This explains why people like me are aliens, because it was so much deterioration concerning the revolutionary mindset and the revolutionary vibration. It was so deteriorated, and then generations just kept coming and coming and coming. You know, that it's almost unheard of that someone has it, because drugs just destroyed it. The baby boomers were groomed in it. They had no choice. Their parents, the baby boomers' parents, were there among Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. But the baby boomers was the recipient of all the drugs in the 80s. So although their parents were and groomed them in all these experiences, drugs took away that experience. Drug took away that mindset. I'm trying to show you how it happened. Can we all agree that drugs really impacted America? Okay, we can all agree on that, right? That impact happened right after Malcolm X and MLK. Some would say that it was intentional by the government to make sure that no one else becomes like Malcolm X or MLK. Some would say that was the reason why I was so flooded in the community, to dope up the minds of the people so that there would never be another Malcolm X and MLK. Well, I mean, the drugs came right after them, directly after them. The next generation, their children, the people that were there among Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, their children were the recipient of the biggest drug boom in America, the generation directly after Malcolm X and MLK was taken from us. So some would say, yeah, that sounds intentional. How is it just, how is it so sharply happening with the next generation? I can see gradually, but it was a sharpness to this as far as time goes. So I want to also cover the second part that failed us, the second people that failed us. The second people that failed generate the second portion of the baby boomers that failed Generation X were not just the recipients of the drug boom. It was also I have to speak concerning the African American community first. it was those the African Americans that were getting into um prominent jobs with white Americans. They were getting into prominent jobs with white Americans, and you would say, well, how they fail their children? Because they lorded this information, they lorded their positions, they lorded their masteries selfishly. They didn't pass it on. And if they did try to pass it on, they were heavy-handed to the point where it wasn't reciprocated properly. So you had, black doctors, you had black lawyers, you had black teachers, you had black policemen, sergeants, and all of that. And they were just now, you got to remember, in the 80s, when the baby boomers were in their 20s, this was a time where they were just now being truly seen as an equal among white people. We were past the assassinations of Malcolm X and MLK. Now people have serious respect for African Americans. They have serious respect, right? So now that created a nice place and time where whites were looking eye to eye, right, with black people, but many black people didn't receive that experience properly, and they were just excited to be among white people, but they were not embracing black people. So they were getting positions among white people and thinking they were better than black people. They wasn't embracing black people anymore. They left them behind, basically. So they failed the black community in this way. Many black doctors, and consider also the crack start coming, the drugs start coming. So many blacks that had these jobs, they just say, well, they dug deeper into the white community. They separated even more. So you had some blacks that went from the baby boomers that went in the direction of drugs. And then you have those who were in the nice sweet spot where there were jobs and that for blacks to be among whites. And it was an experience that they had not yet experienced. They had not yet experienced this nice place and time where they were seen as equals, where they were in the culture, where they were building the culture. Okay? And that's why, and because they were new to it, many didn't handle it properly. I would say 20 to 35% did not handle it properly. And the way they didn't handle it properly is, like I said, they didn't come back to the village and inspire the village to do the same, to share they didn't share their information. They didn't share their life. And part of that was also, like I said, because of all the stuff that was going on in the 80s. The drugs just hit, the gangs and all of that was in full effect. The violence was, and they just went deeper into their vocations, therefore separating deeper from their counterparts, the African-American counterparts. And so that's for the black side of the baby boomers. Now, the white side, I would say it's almost identical, just without the race situation. White baby boomers with Generation X, they were doing vocations. White people were white America obviously was hitting a nice spot in the 80s. They were making money. They were doctors. They were lawyers. They was riding Corvettes. They was in Beverly Hills and all of that. They were in all type of vocations. And it's safe to say, as you look at history, they did not pass the baton to their children. They did not install in their children, what the masteries that they received. Many became arrogant. Many people for the military, baby boomers for the military, became arrogant. As more time went by, innovation, they just became more arrogant because more things were being created and they were a part of it. And then many of the people, whether they were black or white, when they were entering into all these innovative changes as baby boomers, many of them were not grooming their children or making their children students of what they were experiencing. They were not passing the baton. Well, look at Generation X. It's obvious. They look nothing like the baby boomers. Look at the vocations that the baby boomers held. And look at the vocations that the Generation X held. It was like almost comparing winners to losers. Baby boomers were successful in every way. Generation X was failures in every way. But you can't be failures on your own, right? When you got parents. The failure came from the failures came from their parents failing them. Generation X, can we agree, was probably the first failing generation, the generation that everybody just looked down on. They looked down on us. We were the teenagers in the 90s that were smoking a weed and selling crack. We were the first generation of rebellion. That's what young kids don't know. My generation, Generation X, we were the first official true generation of absolute rebellion. We were the first generation of absolute rebellion. Baby boomers kind of rebelled, they protested, they did this about war. They protested about war. They had these views about, the government and all of this. Generation X, we were absolutely rebellious. We were the first absolute rebellious generation. And the reason why is because our parents, many of them, did not pass the baton of mastery. They did not they did not pass on what they had learned. They didn't pass on their masteries as many as their parents had passed on their masteries to them. Right? And some parents were just in drugs, and so they failed Generation X that way. And so, some kids, their parents was on drugs, and, so they became rebellious. They got out in the streets. They became, they became more introverted, into their own life. And that's where you get even the picture that you see on, the image which you see on many movies where you have the rebellious teenager that's kind of reclusive or introverted. We were that main generation. That's why I'm still like that. I'm extroverted, but I come from a generation where, you're just you're culturally groomed to be like that, where you're separate from your parents because they may be doing this, they may be doing drugs, they may be partying, they may be doing this, and you begin to be more introverted unto yourself, and you become rebellious also with all the culture and everything around you. So when you see the teenagers that's kind of rebellious and they kind of to themselves and they in their own room and they don't want to be bothered by the family, that's Generation X. Just so you understand. It's not the baby boomers that were the teenagers in the room telling their parents to get out their rooms. That was Generation X. So see, we were the first generation of full rebellion. And from that point, when we had children, we didn't install nothing in them but rebellion and being cool and all of that. So that's why our children look like cool kids. Cool kids, you know, violent, rebellious like us. Look at the kids of the baby boomers. People born between people born look at the kids of Generation X, born between 1964 and 1965 and 1984. Their children, people born between 1965 and 1984, their children, look at their children. They're rebellious. They're just as tough as their parents. And so, as you can imagine, from Generation X, is just from their kids being rebellious. Really, the generations just became students of rebellion. So it went from being students of revolution to students of rebellion. That's why anarchy has to happen, because now all you have is mindsets that are rebellious. We rebel. That's what we do first. We rebel against things. You know what I'm saying? And many feel the right to, like me, because I feel that baby boomers as a generation of America don't have the right to make us submit to them. See, they were recipients, like I said, of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., so they have a chip on their shoulder like they know more than us because their parents installed all the experiences of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., you know, the white side, you know, it was so many things that white people were doing, going into the military and innovation and all in every area of America. So they have a chip on their shoulder like we owe them some type of respect. But what they forget is how they failed us as a generation. Well, let's look at it for what it is. Look at Generation X. That's where the failure started. You can't say, boy, this is good. Thank you, Lord. You can't say the silent generation, which is Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. generation, failed the baby boomers. You can't say that. So where did the failure start? The failure started with the baby boomers. Now you see what I'm saying. You cannot say the silent generation that was born between 1928 and 1945, which had work ethic, had everything going for them. Revolution, talking about the revolution, starting it. You can't say that generation failed their children. But you can say, with all the drugs alone that the baby boomers were doing, that they failed their children. Just the drugs alone. Just the drugs alone. And you know I'm right. Think about how much drugs and crack and all of that took over. That was the baby boomers doing it. That they made up almost 80% of the people doing it. 80% or better. So the failures in America started with the baby boomers failing Generation X. Whether they were the portion of the generation baby boomers that were doing the drugs, or they were the baby boomers that were lording their own greatness and lording their own and hoarding the throne that they supposed to pass to their children. You had two. It was twofold. People that were hoarding the throne, like, look at my greatness, look who I am, and they didn't pass it on to their children. How you know I know that? How do I know that? Because look at their children. They obviously didn't pass it on. There's no doubt about that. So that's you have one side of the baby boomers that did not pass the baton, didn't pass the throne. You just became, the Generation X just was the parents of, they were the children of great parents with great vocations. But you were the loser. You were the rebellious generation because there was a gap between you and your parents. And not to mention how divorce was, because there was also a sexual boom. So many people were cheating on their spouses. All that was going on too. Not to mention, can't forget about that. Just the sexual revolution that was going on too. This is why Generation X, a lot of them come from broken homes. You know, so Generation X was failed in many ways. Now, and the second part is the drugs, like I said. All the drugs that was going on in all the 80s, the baby boomer generation was the ones doing it. So now you have it. You have why the failure came. You have why there was failure in your community. Okay, as far as your people, that's what happened. I broke it down to you by generation. These are American generations that you need to study. If you call yourself American, I don't, but if you do call yourself American, you need to study the five oldest generations of the American community, so you can see where the failure started. You will conclude the same thing that I concluded, that the failure started with the baby boomer generation. That's where it started. They were the ones doing all the drugs. They were the ones giving their children their butts to kiss. That's where it started. And then it just declined it from there, and it got worse and worse and worse. It never recovered. Now, you will say, well, who's the hope these days? Ironically, it still is Generation X. Generation X, my generation, is the only ones that can really bring about a revolution, because unfortunately everybody younger than us, even the millennials and Generation Z, you're too caught up in the matrix to where you can't even see how deep you're in it already. You're in it. We rebelled. We repelled it. Many of us from Generation X, we repelled it because many of us never really embraced our masters and our teachers. So the deception that went on with the masters, it missed us because they failed us and we felt that way. So we missed much of the deception, the masteries of deception. You came in and you embraced it as a smart generation. Everybody after Generation X, you embraced all the deception. So now you, like, through the technologies, that's how they really got you. The more innovative the technology became, all generations were recipients of mastery deception. And Generation X was already kind of rooted in rebellion. So you're because of just all the culture, the technologies of the culture, the masteries of deception in the culture, and how you embraced it through technologies in culture, you are too deep in the younger generations after Generation X is too deep into the matrix to even, it's like you can't even explain how deep they're in it. You can't explain it. It's like they're swallowed totally in it. There is no hope in the generations that's young. They can't help. They have technology, they're smart, but they're too deep in the matrix. If they try to get out and do what I do, they'll see. You know what I'm saying? That's why I am outside of it, because I am Generation X. I am outside of all of that. If you look at everybody's my age, that's my age, like 40s, Beyonce's my age, Kanye West my age. You look at how they move. Look at how they move. Do you see them all the time? They're outside of it. You're into it, and they're outside of it. Kim Kardashian, same thing. She comes from Generation X. We influence all of the whole country. The Jay-Z's of the world, the Beyoncé's, the Kim Kardashians. We influence America. We are Generation X. We are the only generation that can save America, because even intellectually speaking, it's just something that It's just it's something about our intellect and our understanding and reasoning that can help us maneuver and navigate into a true revolution. Like I said, generations younger than us, they didn't come from all the culture that we came from the 80s and the 90s. Those two decades are very important to understand. Generation, when I'm talking about why we would be the only hope for revolution, because Generation X were the recipients of the 80s and the 90s. We received all that strength from America, all that culture, and it turned into power. It turned into power in many ways that no other generation can get. You can't get it. You had to live there. You would have had to live there. So we're the only generation, although our parents failed us, the baby boomer generation failed Generation X. Although we have been failed as a generation, we still are the only hope, ironically, for true revolution and change. People, the baby boomers, they the one failed us in the first place. What they gonna do? They still sitting around looking for respect, ain't they? Look at them. Just look at them. Because they done all these things back in the 80s and the 90s, and now they're standing around looking for some respect. But they forget one element that they left out, how bad they failed Generation X, their children. Yeah, you did all the stuff you did out there, but look at how you failed your children, though. And that's why when you look to Generation X specifically us, we look right back at you like, are you serious? We are the first rebellious generation. We're like, are you serious? You failed the crap out of us. And you want some type of respect, it's not going to happen. You have to earn it. That's why Generation X, we do not bow down to old people. Please don't take this the wrong way. I will look out for an old woman crossing the street, almost get hit by a car, something like that. Maybe. But we don't just say, well, because you're old, we're going to give you the utmost respect. No, because our parents of our generations failed us. So now we have a sense of, we don't show respect like that based on that. We don't show respect like that based on that. How bad we were failed by our parents. So when we look at older people, this is what we think about. How we were failed. So if you find someone that kind of is up in age and they really make old people earn their respect, I guarantee you they come from Generation X. Most likely, I am one of those people. I don't care how old you are. I'm just as old as you. And see, we come from the rebellious generation. I'm not saying embrace rebellion per se, but we're independent. We're fiercely independent. Look at the Generation X. Fiercely independent. You're not just going to get us to just bow down and respect you. I don't care what it is, where you come from. It could be even within Christianity. You have to start looking at generations. Christianity has to do it too. You have to do it because you have to see where the failure started. Okay, you got your life together. You became a Christian. Many of you became preachers, but you're not keeping it 100 about how the baby boomers failed the Generation X. We were the first real cool kids, man. Generation X, yeah. Because we were in the 80s and the 90s. We had all that stuff from the 80s and the 90s. The Jordans, the clothes, the pullovers, the pullover jackets, the starter jackets, all of that. We had all of that, man. And you can't, listen, you can wear vintage. You had to have lived it where you see other people and you had to live in that, man. You know what I'm saying? You had to see these things on TV. You know, we are the real cool. We were the first cool. You know what I'm saying? We were among the Michael Jordans. We was among Mike Tyson and Michael Jackson. We, Generation X, were the kids that was recipients of all of that. So, who could be cooler than the generation that were kids in Michael Jackson time? Like, we were the coolest kids in Prince time, you know? I remember as a little kid watching Prince on TV as a kid. I was a kid, like, what? When it came out, I was like 4 years old when Prince Purple Rain came out. I was watching that as a kid. We was the recipients of all of that. And it's no way in the world, you know, kids can capture that, because it was a whole world. It was an atmosphere. You can go back and watch it, but you can't. But we had an atmosphere attached to it. You know what I mean? So, but watch the baby boomers, because they'll try to hoard and lord respect from you like you owe them that. Watch the military. Watch the police. Watch the military baby boomers. You've seen them. Arrogant. Arrogant as can be. They act like you just owe them some kind of respect. That's the baby boomers, because they were doing all those things. You know, it was a time where everything in the 80s and the 90s, you know, they was in their 20s in the 80s. The baby boomers. So imagine being in your 20s, you know, they had all this stuff going on in America. You see what I'm saying? And they became, think about it. Now you see what I'm saying? They were very arrogant from all the things that they experienced culturally, as far as vocations, military jobs, police jobs, et cetera, doctor jobs. It was just booming in the 80s and the 90s. And the thing about it was, black people and white people were getting along the most in those 2 decades. To me, ironically, it seemed like they were kind of getting along because of the culture. You know what I mean? All the movies. It was the culture that made black people and white people kind of get along. You know what I'm saying? Then we got back into, later on after the 90s, we got back into, you know, extreme police brutalities and things, police shootings and things. We didn't see that when I was a kid. When I was a kid in the 90s, we didn't see every month some kind of police shooting. Every 2 or 3 months, some kind of police brutality or something. So, and then a lot of people blame that on race. So, you know, in the 80s and the 90s, you had all those movies, you know, all the E.T. and Gremlins and Ghostbusters and all these different movies and things. And black and white people were coming together making it. You know, so black people watch white people, then white people watch black people. We were more merged together in the 80s and the 90s. We were. You know, so it's just an arrogance, though. The sad part is it's an arrogance that the baby boomers had, you know, from that time, because of all of those things. Even the people coming together, it made black people arrogant. It made white people arrogant. White people thought they were down and everything, you know, and black people thought they were getting ahead being around white people. See what I'm saying? So, you know, with this arrogance, you know, they feel like they're entitled to a certain amount of respect off tops, like instantaneously. But just like I said, the part that they leave out is the part that they failed the whole generation. And it's hard to admit that. You may have not failed your children. My parents did pretty decent in my life, particularly. But if you really look at the whole community, it's without a doubt that Generation X was failed by the baby boomers. You know, and the failures come to different degrees. You know, there's extreme failures, there's minimum failures, you know, and, you know, and it's sad. And, you know, for people who are failed extremely, you know, it was sad. But the same generations that failed us, baby boomers, the main generation that failed all of America, if you had to pinpoint a generation, it would absolutely have to be them. But ironically, because of the time that they were born and the time that what they came into, being recipients of Malcolm X teachings and Martin Luther King teachings and all of that, in the time of that time in America, and with the 80s, them being in their 20s and 30s and stuff in the 80s, they just feel like, you owe them some type of respect. You owe them something. Look at how they carry themselves. It's because of the time that they came from. That's what it is. That's what it is, man. And they'll just look at you like because they older, you supposed to owe them some type of respect. And see, I'm from Generation X, and I'm like, because I remember how bad y'all failed our generation. Now I'm pretty sure you're a baby boomer. I'm pretty sure you are. And baby boomers started in 1946 to 1964. I'm pretty sure half of these people out here, these older people, demanding respect are baby boomers. And they are the absolute ones who failed us as a community. You all need to realize this, because you haven't challenged why have all of this happened? Why hasn't it been another Malcolm X and the Martin Luther King Jr.? Why hasn't it been that? Why hasn't it been revolutionaries? Why hasn't it been that? Because I'm telling you what it is. Because the baby boomers, they failed Generation X, and Generation X just became rebellious and fiercely independent, and then they just passed on. It just went from revolutionary mindset and vibration to rebellious mindset and rebellious vibration and fiercely independent vibration. That's what happened. And so they passed that on to their kids, and so on and so on and so on. So now what you have basically is the descendants of Generation X. Boom. That's what you got going. You don't have the generation of baby boomers because they failed. So how are we truly the descendants of baby boomers? We're not. I got to do a video on this too. We're not the descendants of baby boomers. We are the descendants, the American community, for the most part, the children here, that's 40, early 50s, and I would say late 40s, mid 40s to on down. That's all Generation X people. They have nothing to do with baby boomers, because the cutoff of all of the things that we were supposed to get from Malcolm X and MLK, all of that energy, ask yourself, why isn't it here? Because the baby boomers they were drinking, they were having sex, they were smoking crack, they were freebasing. And for people that don't know, cocaine, it came out December 1898. That's when cocaine came out in America. Cocaine came out December 1898. That's when cocaine hit America. I know, I didn't know it was that long ago either. Cocaine hit America in 1898. Look at it 100 years later. 1998. It was crazy 100 years later. So I'm trying to show you where everything went haywire. Why we all now are that we are descendants. you all are descendants of Generation X. You ain't descendants of the baby boomers because they didn't pass on their DNA to us. So how can you be baby? How can you, now you see where the confusion and the craziness is at? Because baby boomers did not pass their DNA properly on to Generation X. Look at Generation X. So how can you say they are descendants per se? How can you say we are descendants per se of the baby boomers? You can't really say it. So we became the first rebellious generation, like I said, with the rebellious vibration and mindset. And we just continued that on in our children and so on and so on and so on. So now everybody my age and younger are Generation X. You see where this is going? You see that? And how ironic. Because now see the calculation and the equation is coming together. We are the only generation